A former Navy SEAL thought he'd left the noise of the world behind when he bought an abandoned cabin deep in Idaho's frozen woods. But the night he stepped inside, he heard a faint whimper, not from a ghost, but from beneath the floorboards. When he pried open the old cellar door, he froze. A trembling little girl was hiding in the dark, clutching a wounded German shepherd, whispering, "Please, don't tell anyone." He had no idea that this moment, this whisper, would change his life forever. What happened next will make you cry and believe in second chances again. Before we start, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The snow had been falling over northern Idaho for days. Pine trees bowed beneath its weight, and the mountains of the Sawtooth Range stood like silent sentinels against the fading sun. The wind carried a sharp, lonely sound, the kind that seemed to whistle through a man's bones. 15 miles from the nearest town, an old dirt road wound through the forest toward a cabin almost forgotten by time. Its roof sagged under the snow, and its windows were fogged with frost. That was where Ethan Cole arrived, hoping that the silence of the wilderness could drown the war still echoing in his head. Ethan was 39, a tall white man with short brown hair and deep blue eyes that never stopped scanning his surroundings. A faint scar crossed the right side of his jaw, a reminder from a roadside explosion in Afghanistan that took more than just his hearing in one ear. It took his closest friend. Since his discharge from the Navy SEALs, he had moved through life like a ghost, detached, deliberate, and always on guard. He had spent his last $10,000 on this abandoned property. To most, it was just a wreck, a place swallowed by snow and rot. But to Ethan, it was a chance to disappear, to build something with his own hands that didn't involve orders, gunfire, or grief. He parked the old blue pickup beside the porch, stepped out, and let the snow crunch beneath his boots. The air was so cold it stung his lungs. He stood for a moment, watching his breath form clouds, then exhaled deeply. "This'll do," he muttered, pushing open the door. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. Dust hung in the air like fog. A stone fireplace sat cold in the corner, and old wallpaper peeled from the walls in long, curling strips. The wooden floors creaked with every step he took. He ran a gloved hand across the windowsill, leaving a streak through the dust. There was something strangely comforting about the decay. It was quiet decay. That night, he lit a small fire. Orange light flickered across his weathered face as he sat on the floor, eating canned soup from a dented pot. Outside, the snowstorm raged harder. The cabin groaned under the wind. Somewhere in the woods, a coyote howled, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt truly alone. He fell asleep in the armchair beside the fire. But sleep, for Ethan, was never peace. It was ambushes, explosions, the smell of burnt sand, the cries of the dying. His hands twitched even in rest. Then, through the blur of a nightmare, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. At first, he thought it was the wind. Then again, whimper. A faint bark, weak and broken. It came from below the floorboards. Ethan's eyes opened wide. He grabbed his flashlight and stood still for a moment, listening. The sound came again. A short, desperate bark followed by what might have been a sob. He knelt down, pressing his ear to the floor. What the hell? The sound was definitely coming from under him. Somewhere in the cabin's basement, or what was left of it. He moved the rug aside and found a small trap door in the corner, half hidden under debris. Rust covered its hinges, and old scratches marked the wood, as if something had tried to claw its way out. For a second, Ethan's heart began to race. He told himself it was just an animal. A coyote, trapped below maybe. But that didn't explain the human-like cry he'd heard. He hesitated, then exhaled. "All right, let's see what you are." He pulled the door open. The hinges shrieked. Cold, stale air rose from the darkness below. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as he pointed it down the creaking wooden steps. "Hello," he called out. Silence. Then, from somewhere in the black, a soft whimper. He descended carefully, the steps groaning under his weight. The smell of damp and rust grew stronger. His light swept across concrete walls, old crates, cobwebs, and then stopped. In the far corner, huddled against the wall, was a figure. Small, human, a girl. She looked around 13, thin, pale, her long blonde hair tangled and dirty. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide with terror. She wore a torn brown coat over a faded hoodie, her knees drawn tightly to her chest. In her arms was a large German shepherd, its fur matted with dirt, one front leg bent unnaturally. The dog let out a low, defensive growl. Ethan froze where he stood. "Hey," he said softly, lowering the flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. "It's okay." The girl flinched. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't tell anyone." Ethan slowly crouched, palms open. "I'm not gonna hurt you. What happened to the dog?" The German shepherd kept its eyes locked on him, growling faintly. Its body shook from exhaustion. Ethan noticed the animal's ribs pressing through its fur. 6, maybe 7 years old. Strong once, but now barely holding on. "I'm a friend," Ethan said, inching closer. "Let me help him, okay?" She shook her head. "He's fine. He just needs rest." Her voice cracked on the last word. "What's your name?" Ethan asked. No answer. Just silence except for the faint crackling of the fire upstairs. The girl's breathing was ragged. She looked like she hadn't eaten properly in days. He studied the cellar. Some old crates had been dragged into a makeshift bed. Cans of beans lay open nearby, clearly scavenged. Someone had been living here for a while. "All right," Ethan murmured, finally standing. "You stay here. I'll bring something warm." He climbed back up, returned with an old blanket and a pot of soup, and set them at the bottom of the stairs. "I'll leave these here," he said quietly. "If you come up, the fire's warm." Then he closed the hatch behind him. The next morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the cabin's frosted windows. Ethan woke to find the blanket gone, the pot empty. A small footprint of snow led from the stairs to the corner of the room, then back down again. He smiled faintly. Later that day, while repairing a leak in the roof, Ethan discovered something strange. Knife marks carved deep into one of the beams. Short, frantic strokes. Not from recent days. Years old. They spelled out 3 crooked letters. Help. He stared at them for a long moment. Maybe the rumors were true. Maybe someone had hidden here before. That evening, the wind rose again. Ethan sat by the fire, his mind uneasy. Every creak of the house sounded alive, like whispers buried in the wood. He turned his head toward the floor, the cellar door slightly ajar. Footsteps. Light. And there she was. The girl stood at the edge of the shadows, clutching the German shepherd in her arms. The animal limped beside her but no longer growled. Ethan rose slowly. "It's warmer up here," he said. "You can sit." The girl hesitated, then stepped closer. Her hand shook as she placed the dog near the fire. Ethan saw tears in her eyes as the warmth reached them both. He knelt down and carefully examined the wound on the dog's leg. "Not broken," he muttered. "Just deep. You've been cleaning it?" She nodded. "With snow?" He gave a small smile. "Smart kid." After a long pause, she finally spoke again, voice barely above a whisper. "His name's Shadow." Ethan looked at the dog, whose deep brown eyes met his with silent understanding. "Shadow," he repeated. "Good name." He got up, fetched some bandages and disinfectant from his truck, and tended to the wound. The girl watched every move, ready to shield the dog again if he made a sudden gesture. When he finished, he handed her a mug of warm water. She accepted it, still cautious. "What's your name?" he asked again. "Maggie," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Maggie. I'm Ethan. You and Shadow can stay tonight. We'll figure things out tomorrow." For a moment her lips trembled, as if she wanted to say thank you, but the word had been buried by too much fear. He didn't press her. He just placed another log on the fire and sat down. The flames crackled softly. Shadow rested his head on Maggie's lap. The girl leaned back against the wall, eyes closing, exhaustion finally winning. Ethan watched them both. Outside, snow still fell through the pines, thick and endless. Inside, for the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. "Stay as long as you need," he murmured, barely audible over the fire. "Tomorrow. We'll see." And with that, the house, once a hollow shell of whispers, finally breathed again. The storm outside had not stopped for 3 days. The forest was buried under a heavy quilt of snow, and the cabin seemed smaller, wrapped in silence and frost. Ethan moved through it like a ghost, lighting the fire, checking the windows, listening to the groaning timbers of the old structure. He had gotten used to quiet, but now there was another kind, the kind that came from holding your breath so you wouldn't disturb someone fragile. The girl hadn't said a word since that night. She stayed mostly near the corner of the main room, curled under a blanket, her German shepherd, Shadow, never leaving her side. Ethan kept his distance. He knew what fear looked like. He had seen it in war, in hostages, in men who'd lost everything. It was a living thing, coiled deep inside, waiting for a reason to trust again. Every morning he made breakfast and left a plate on the table. Sometimes it went untouched. Other times, when he wasn't looking, the food was gone. He didn't ask questions. On the third morning, as he chopped wood behind the cabin, Ethan looked through the frost-covered window and saw her standing for the first time. She was small, maybe 13, wearing his oversized coat, the hem dragging across the wooden floor. Blonde hair, unkempt and tangled, fell into her eyes. She moved quietly, almost ghost-like, placing logs into the fire for Shadow's warmth. The dog, now bandaged and resting on a blanket, raised his head to follow her every motion. Ethan turned back to his work, pretending not to notice. He knew better than to corner someone who had been running. He remembered how cornered he had felt once, trapped in a desert war, told to hold a position that had already burned. The difference was that this girl had no team to pull her out. That night, when the wind howled through the pines, Ethan woke to the soft pad of paws near his chair. Shadow stood there, tail low but wagging slowly. The dog sniffed his hand before sitting beside him, one paw still wrapped in bandages. His fur, black and tan, coarse and thick, shimmered faintly in the firelight. Ethan rubbed his ear gently. "You're healing fast," he murmured. The dog tilted his head, eyes alert as if understanding. When Ethan raised his hand slightly, Shadow reacted instantly. Straight posture, ears up, like he was waiting for a command. "Sit," Ethan tried quietly. The dog obeyed immediately. He frowned. "Stay." The dog froze in place. Then, when Ethan whispered, "Search," Shadow barked once, short and precise, scanning the room as if expecting a signal. Ethan leaned back slowly, realization dawning. "You're trained. Military or police?" His gaze drifted toward the sleeping girl. "So, what were you two running from?" The next day, Maggie finally spoke. Not much, just a whisper of a thank you when he refilled her bowl with soup. Her voice was small, hesitant, but there was something sharp beneath it. The kind of survival instinct born from years of being afraid. She didn't make eye contact, but when he mentioned the dog's name, her shoulders eased slightly. For a few days they existed in quiet routine. Ethan repaired leaks in the roof and chopped more wood. Maggie cleaned Shadow's wound with snowmelt and fed him scraps. In the evenings, she sat near the window, staring out into the endless white. Once, Ethan caught her tracing shapes into the frost on the glass. Tiny hearts, a few letters that faded before he could read them. He didn't ask, but at night, when he thought she was asleep, he sometimes heard her whisper, "Mom," or "Don't find me," followed by the dog's low whimper. Ethan's curiosity grew heavier. He wanted to know, but every time he saw the tremor in her hands or the way Shadow's body tensed whenever he moved too quickly, he stopped himself. People like them didn't heal from questions, only from time. On the fifth night, while the snowstorm outside swirled like an ocean of white noise, Ethan sat by the window cleaning his rifle. It wasn't loaded, the action was muscle memory, something to quiet his mind. Behind him, the fire popped and hissed. He heard footsteps, light ones. Turning slightly, he saw her standing near the hearth, the dog close at her side. She was watching him work with the rifle, her expression unreadable. "You're a soldier," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "Was," he replied. Her eyes lingered on the weapon. "Did you ever shoot someone?" The question hung in the air like frost. Ethan stared at her for a long time before answering. "Yes," he said quietly. "Too many." She didn't flinch. She just looked at the floor. "My stepdad has one too," she said, "but he doesn't use it like you do." Ethan froze. "Stepdad?" She hesitated, then sat down, Shadow resting his head on her lap. The firelight caught her face, still so young but carrying the weariness of someone much older. "He's looking for me," she said finally. "He's not a good man." Ethan said nothing, letting her fill the silence. "He used to hurt my mom. When she died, he said it was my fault. I ran. Shadow came with me. He said if he found me, he'd—" Her voice broke and she pressed her face into the dog's fur. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had seen cruelty before, but it always hit differently when it was close enough to touch. "You're safe here," he said. She shook her head. "He'll find me. He always does." Shadow let out a low growl as if sensing her fear. Ethan sat back, rubbing his temples. The girl's words stirred something old in him. Guilt, anger, the instinct to protect. He hadn't come here to save anyone, but maybe the forest, the house, the silence, none of it had been coincidence. The following morning, he went to the town 10 miles away for supplies. He walked into a small grocery store where the air smelled of pine cleaner and coffee. The woman behind the counter was in her early 30s, tall, with auburn hair pulled into a loose braid and kind brown eyes that hid fatigue. She had the calm demeanor of someone who had spent years pretending to be fine. "Morning," she said, noticing the frost on his jacket. "You're new here." "Moved into the old Jensen cabin," he replied. She paused. "The one by Whispering Creek? Nobody's lived there in years." He nodded. "Guess I'm nobody then." She smiled faintly but studied him. "You've got that look," she said. "Soldier?" He nodded again. She didn't press further. Instead, she handed him a pack of bandages and a can of coffee. "You might need these. Storm's supposed to last another week." Ethan thanked her and left, but her words lingered. Back at the cabin, Maggie was pacing near the door when he returned. Shadow barked once, tail wagging anxiously. "You were gone too long," she said, voice trembling. "Just supplies," Ethan replied. But when he looked at her face, pale, eyes darting toward the woods, he understood. Fear had roots in her deeper than any storm could bury. That night, she didn't eat. She sat on the floor beside Shadow, hands clenched in his fur, eyes fixed on the window. Ethan joined her, sitting on the opposite side of the fire. The logs crackled softly between them. "Do you trust him?" he asked quietly, nodding toward the dog. She looked down at Shadow. "With my life." Ethan smiled faintly. "That makes 2 of us." Her expression softened, if only for a moment. The storm howled louder outside, shaking the windows. Snow drifted past the glass in endless waves. Ethan leaned back, the warmth of the fire painting his face in gold. "You're lucky, kid," he murmured after a while. You still believe in people." Maggie glanced at him through the flames, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Do you?" Ethan didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, its glow reflecting in his tired blue eyes, the same eyes that had seen too much. Shadow yawned, laid his head on Maggie's lap, and drifted into sleep. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering every footprint, every path. Inside, 3 heartbeats shared the same rhythm. 1 man, 1 girl, 1 loyal dog, clinging to warmth in a frozen world. The storm had finally broken, leaving the forest wrapped in an eerie calm. Snow glittered beneath a pale sun, and the air carried that fragile silence that always follows chaos. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low, and the warmth of it could almost convince a man the world wasn't as cruel as it used to be. Almost. Ethan sat by the window, cleaning his hands with a cloth darkened by engine oil. He'd spent the morning fixing the generator. The thing coughed and spat like an old soldier trying to breathe. But it worked. Across the room, Maggie sat on the floor, drawing small shapes into the frost on the window pane with her finger. Shadow, now stronger, lay beside her with his head resting across her knees, amber eyes half closed. He still limped slightly, but his spirit was awake again, alert, loyal, always watching. Ethan had grown used to their quiet companionship. It filled the hollow corners of the cabin in a way silence never had. But peace never lasted long in his life, and that afternoon, the crunch of tires on snow shattered it. He stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the glare. A dark SUV was parked near the old pine tree, steam rising from its hood. A man climbed out. Broad-shouldered, early 40s, his uniform immediately recognizable even under the gray winter coat. Sheriff Paul Grady. He was taller than Ethan remembered, his once dark hair now streaked with silver, the lines on his face carved by years of dealing with other people's mistakes. He had a straightforward presence, the kind of man who had long learned to speak in facts, not feelings. "Didn't think I'd find anyone up here," Grady said, closing the door behind him. His breath formed clouds in the cold air. "But rumor has it, you bought the old Jensen place." Ethan's hand tightened around his jacket zipper. "That's right," he replied carefully. "Just fixing it up." The sheriff nodded, his gaze drifting toward the cabin's window where Maggie's faint shadow moved behind the frosted glass. "You living alone?" he asked casually. "Mostly," Ethan said. Grady's tone stayed friendly, but his eyes told another story. Sharp, calculating. "We got reports of a missing kid," he said. 13-year-old girl, name's Maggie Turner, vanished 2 weeks ago south of the border. Last seen near a gas station with a big black dog." Ethan didn't blink. "You think she made it all the way up here?" Grady shrugged. "Stranger things happen when people run scared." The silence that followed felt heavier than the snow. Ethan gestured toward the cabin. "You want coffee?" It was a deflection, and Grady took it, though his gaze lingered on the tracks near the porch. One set small, the other 4-pawed. Inside, Maggie froze the moment the door opened. Her small frame stiffened, eyes darting to the back of the cabin. Ethan gave her a look, calm but firm, a silent promise that she was safe for now. The sheriff removed his gloves, rubbing his hands together. "You always did pick the loneliest places," he said, glancing around. "Guess some habits die hard." "Guess so," Ethan replied, pouring him a cup. "Still keeping order in town?" "Trying," Grady said. "People go missing, debts don't get paid, and winter keeps killing what's left." He took a sip, eyes flicking toward Maggie, who had retreated deeper into the corner. "Quiet little house you've got." Ethan nodded. "That's the point." A knock at the door interrupted them. 3 short taps. Ethan opened it to find Clara Bell standing outside, cheeks flushed pink from the cold. Her auburn hair was tucked under a brown wool hat, a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She carried a small satchel and smiled gently, though her eyes showed surprise at the sheriff's presence. "I brought medicine," she said. "For the dog." Her voice was calm, warm, the kind of tone people used to remind the world they still believed in kindness. Clara Bell had lived in town her whole life. She ran the small veterinary clinic near the main road, and most folks said she had more compassion than the entire county combined. Widowed young, she'd lost her husband in a logging accident 5 years ago, and since then, she had learned to fill silence with grace. Grady nodded politely. "Miss Bell?" "Sheriff," she replied, then looked to Ethan. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're fine," Ethan said, motioning her in. When Clara's gaze fell on Maggie, her face softened instantly. "You poor thing," she murmured. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The girl stiffened, but Clara's tone held no judgment, only care. She knelt by Shadow, examining the healing wound on his leg. "Strong boy," she said to him, running her hand gently through his fur. "He's got working dog training. Police, maybe military." Ethan met her eyes briefly. She understood the unspoken truth between them. Then, quietly, Clara said to Maggie, "You don't have to be afraid. Not here." Grady's eyes narrowed slightly, his intuition sharpening. "Funny," he said, voice casual but heavy with meaning. "You all talk like you already know her." The air thickened. Clara stood slowly. "I see a lot of lost things in my job, Sheriff. Sometimes animals, sometimes people. You learn to recognize fear when you see it." Grady turned to Ethan. "So, you want to tell me what's really going on, Cole?" Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Just a girl and a dog trying to stay warm," he said evenly. "That's all." "You're harboring a missing person," Grady countered. "That's not nothing." "You ever think maybe she's safer here than wherever she came from?" Ethan shot back. The two men stared at each other, one bound by duty, the other by conscience. The fire crackled, between them like a ticking clock. Clara stepped in softly. "Paul," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "do you remember when my husband died on that logging road? You were the one who found him. You told me no one should die alone." Grady looked at her, jaw tight. "I remember." "Then you know," she said, glancing at Maggie, "that sometimes following the law isn't the same as doing what's right." Grady sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're putting me in a bad spot, Clara." Ethan's voice was low, steady. "So am I." Grady looked from one to the other, then toward the window where the snow began to fall again, light and endless. Finally, he spoke. "Her stepfather's heading north," he said. "Word is, he's armed and looking for something he lost. He's not the type to stop until he finds it." Ethan's hands clenched unconsciously. "If he comes here—" "Then you'd better be ready," Grady interrupted. His tone softened slightly. "I'll buy you time, but you can't hide her forever. Someone will notice." With that, he pulled on his gloves, heading toward the door. "You didn't see me today," he added. After the sheriff's car disappeared down the road, Clara stayed. The silence that followed was thick enough to break. Maggie, who had been listening from the corner, stood up, eyes glassy. "He's coming," she whispered. "He'll find me." Clara turned, kneeling beside her. "Not tonight," she said gently. "You're safe tonight." But Maggie didn't look convinced. Her small frame trembled. Ethan stared into the fire, his mind spiraling. He'd spent his life following orders, missions, rules, chains of command. But now, standing in that cabin with a frightened child and a dog who'd once known violence, he felt something stronger than duty, the desperate need to protect. Later that evening, as Clara packed her satchel, she hesitated near the door. "Ethan," she said softly, "you can't carry other people's ghosts forever." He didn't look up. "Maybe not," he replied, "but I can keep them from freezing to death." She smiled sadly. "You remind me of him," she whispered. "My husband. He always thought he could fix broken things just by staying." Then she stepped out into the night, leaving behind a silence that wasn't peaceful anymore. Ethan sat down heavily, staring into the flickering light. Maggie had retreated upstairs, Shadow following close behind. He heard faint movement, then nothing. Hours passed. The wind rose again. When he finally went to check on them, the door to the small room was open, and the window slightly ajar. Snow had begun to drift inside. Her footprints led out into the darkness, 2 sets, one human, one canine. Ethan stood in the cold doorway, heart sinking. "Damn it, kid," he whispered. The storm swallowed his voice. He reached for his coat and flashlight, stepping out into the night where the forest waited, vast, white, and full of ghosts. The storm began as a whisper, a faint wind sliding through the pine needles, but by nightfall it had grown into a roar. Snow fell thick and fast, swallowing the forest whole. The cabin lights flickered in the distance, nearly lost to the white chaos. Ethan Cole stepped out into the storm, scarf drawn up to his jaw, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the swirling snow. He could barely see his own boots, yet he pressed forward, driven by a gnawing panic clawing at his chest. Maggie and Shadow had been gone for hours. The tracks outside had already started to disappear under the storm's weight, and with every gust of wind, he felt time slipping away. Sheriff Paul Grady was beside him, wrapped in his thick brown coat, his badge barely visible beneath the frost. The man's face was hard with focus, years of chasing fugitives through worse. "We'll fan out north," he shouted above the wind. "She can't be far, not in this." Ethan nodded. His blue eyes burned with worry, scanning every shadow, every tree. Behind them, Clara Bell followed, clutching a small medical pack to her chest. Her auburn hair whipped in the wind, snow tangled in her braid, her cheeks red from the cold. She wasn't built for the hunt, tall but slender, hands trembling from the cold, yet she refused to stay behind. "You'll freeze out here," Grady had warned. "Then so will they," she'd answered. They trudged into the storm, 3 fading silhouettes swallowed by white. Miles away, deep in the forest, Maggie Turner stumbled through knee-deep snow, her small frame shivering under a torn coat. Her blonde hair clung to her face, now pale from the cold. Shadow walked close beside her, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. His black and tan fur was frosted, his paws leaving faint prints that vanished seconds later. The blizzard howled around them, and Maggie could barely see beyond a few feet. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Every tree looked the same. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Her body ached, her lips were numb, and fear thudded inside her chest like a second heartbeat. She stopped for a moment, leaning against a tree, gasping. "We can't stop, Shadow," she whispered, her voice breaking. The dog nuzzled her gloved hand, whining softly. He could sense her exhaustion, but also her terror. Somewhere behind them, another sound rose above the wind. Faint at first, then unmistakable, the growl of an engine. A man's silhouette moved between the trees. Back in the search group, Ethan's flashlight caught something hanging from a low branch. A pink scarf, frozen stiff, fluttering weakly in the wind. His heart clenched. He grabbed it, fingers shaking. The scarf still held warmth, faint but real. "Maggie," he whispered. For a brief moment, the storm around him faded, replaced by another blinding white memory. Afghanistan, years ago. The snow was sand then, the wind heat instead of frost, but the same helplessness had burned inside him. He saw his squad mate bleeding out, eyes wide with fear. Ethan had carried him through the dust, whispering the same word again and again. Hold on. But that man hadn't made it. He blinked the memory away and looked to Grady. "She's close. I can feel it." Grady nodded. "Then we move faster." Maggie could feel the presence behind her now. The crunch of boots in snow, the glint of a flashlight sweeping through the blizzard. Her stepfather. The man was in his late 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, face rough with stubble, eyes bloodshot with anger and alcohol. His breath came out in ragged bursts as he trudged through the snow, clutching a pistol in a gloved hand. "Maggie," he shouted, voice slurred and vicious, "you can't hide from me, girl. You think anyone cares about you?" Maggie flinched and pressed closer to Shadow. The dog's growl rumbled low, almost lost to the wind. She hid behind a fallen log, clutching Shadow's fur. Tears froze on her lashes. Then, gunfire. A sharp crack, echoing through the trees. Snow burst from the trunk beside her head. Shadow barked once, deep and loud, giving away their position, but it also alerted Ethan's group miles away. "Shots fired," Grady barked, drawing his own gun. "This way." They ran through the storm, stumbling over roots buried in snow. Clara followed close, clutching the pack tighter, eyes wide with fear but determination. She couldn't see more than shadows, but she could hear Ethan's heavy breathing ahead of her, see the faint flash of his light cutting through white chaos. Maggie and Shadow broke into a clearing, snow up to her knees. Ahead, through the curtain of snow, a flicker of orange light, an abandoned hunting shack. She stumbled toward it. Shadow circled her protectively, barking once, twice, but before they reached it, a dark shape loomed out of the storm. Her stepfather. His pistol gleamed in the dim light. "There you are," he rasped, grinning. "You cost me a lot of trouble, kid." Maggie froze. "Please," she begged, voice trembling. "I didn't do anything." "You ran," he spat. "You talked to cops. You ruined everything." He raised the gun, but Shadow lunged. The German Shepherd leapt through the snow, powerful and fearless, jaws locking onto the man's arm. He screamed, staggering back, firing wildly. One bullet grazed Shadow's flank. Another tore through the air just past Maggie's shoulder. The dog held firm, growling deep, buying precious seconds. Then Ethan burst from the tree line. He fired one warning shot into the air. "Drop it!" he shouted. His voice cut through the wind like thunder. The man turned, eyes wild. "You don't know what she's done!" he yelled, shaking his arm violently to throw the dog off. Shadow fell into the snow, panting, blood streaking his fur. Ethan stepped forward, steady and cold. "I don't care what you think she's done." The man raised his gun and the world seemed to slow. Ethan dove forward, shoving Maggie aside. The shot rang out. Pain tore through his shoulder, hot and sharp. He fell, snow exploding around him. Clara's scream carried faintly through the wind. But before the man could aim again, a new voice cut through the storm. "Drop it, Travis!" Sheriff Grady emerged from the trees, weapon drawn. His stance was solid, his face unreadable. "It's over." For a moment, Travis hesitated. Then, with a snarl, he turned the gun toward Grady. 2 shots rang out. One missed, the other didn't. Travis dropped to his knees, the pistol falling into the snow. The sheriff stood firm, gun still raised, breath heavy. "It's over," he repeated, quieter this time. Clara ran past him, kneeling beside Ethan. Blood stained his coat, but he was still conscious. "You're fine," she said, her hands trembling as she pressed bandages to the wound. "You're going to be fine." Ethan gritted his teeth, wincing. "Check the dog." She turned to Shadow, who whimpered but wagged his tail weakly. His wound was shallow. Clara's hands shook as she cleaned it with snowmelt and wrapped it in a torn strip of cloth. "You brave boy," she whispered. Maggie knelt beside Ethan, tears freezing on her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I just didn't want anyone else to get hurt." Ethan reached up with his uninjured hand and touched her shoulder. "You didn't," he said softly. "You made it back. That's what matters." The wind began to die down. The storm that had swallowed the forest for 2 days was finally breaking apart. Through the trees, faint dawn light bled across the snow. Maggie turned to Shadow and hugged him tightly, burying her face in his fur. "We're safe now," she whispered through tears. We're really safe." Grady stood a few paces away, lowering his weapon, watching the scene quietly. His eyes softened. Clara, exhausted, sat beside Ethan, her breath visible in the cold. The snow had turned pink in the sunrise. The blizzard was over. 3 months passed since the night the storm broke and the forest nearly swallowed them whole. Winter had loosened its grip on the mountains, leaving behind fields of soft green and the smell of thawed earth. The snow had melted from the cabin's roof, revealing old cedar shingles that gleamed in the morning light. Birds had returned to the treetops, their songs filling the once frozen silence with life again. The air was still cold enough to sting the lungs, but for the first time in years, Ethan Cole could breathe without feeling like something heavy was pressing on his chest. His shoulders still ached where the bullet had grazed him, a faint scar cutting through the skin like a memory etched in steel. But the pain no longer belonged to the past. It had become part of his strength. Each morning he woke to the same view. The valley of whispering pines bathed in golden light, the wind humming through the trees as if whispering prayers for the living and the lost. Maggie had changed too. The thin, frightened girl who once hid in shadows now smiled in the open sun. Her blonde hair had grown longer, her cheeks flushed with health. She wore overalls splattered with paint, standing barefoot on the wooden porch, carefully brushing strokes of white across the cabin wall. The once dark shelter now shimmered with warmth and color. Shadow ran in circles nearby, a 6-year-old German shepherd with sleek black and tan fur and eyes that never stopped watching her. He carried a small paintbrush in his mouth, tail wagging furiously, occasionally dropping it at her feet like an eager apprentice. Maggie laughed, a bright, unguarded sound that filled the clearing. Ethan leaned against the porch post, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand, watching them with quiet pride. Clara Bell stood beside him, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. She was dressed in her usual flannel shirt and faded jeans, her brown eyes soft with kindness, but lined with the sort of fatigue that only comes from caring too deeply for too long. Since that night, she had been coming up every weekend from town, helping them rebuild both the cabin and their lives. They had turned the place into something new. Whispering Pines Rescue Center, a home for stray dogs, lost children, and anyone who had nowhere else to go. The small wooden sign leaned against the fence, waiting to be hung. Maggie had painted it herself, in uneven letters, but with a heart drawn beneath the words, "Every soul deserves a home." Ethan smiled at the sight. "You outdid yourself," he said. Maggie turned, brushing a streak of paint across her cheek. "It's not done yet." Shadow smudged the bottom. The dog barked proudly, as if taking credit. Clara chuckled. "I think he's just signing it." Ethan walked over, crouched beside the sign, and lifted it carefully into place. The wood creaked, the nails sank in, and when he stepped back the words glowed softly in the morning light. It felt right, like something sacred had been restored. Later that afternoon, the rumble of an engine echoed up the dirt road. Sheriff Paul Grady's truck came into view, dust swirling behind it. He parked near the gate and stepped out, still wearing his familiar tan coat, though the weather no longer called for it. His gray hair caught the wind as he approached, eyes squinting against the sun. "Well," he said, stopping at the fence, hands on his hips. "Looks like you've gone and started a whole operation here." Ethan shrugged modestly. "Keeps me busy." Grady smirked. "That's one way to say you've built yourself a new unit. Different kind of war, though." Ethan chuckled. "This one's worth fighting." The sheriff's gaze drifted toward Maggie, who was now tossing a ball for Shadow across the yard. The dog bounded after it, kicking up dust and laughter. "She looks better," Grady said. "She is," Clara replied softly. "She's home." Grady nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, for years I thought my badge was what kept order, but sometimes it's not laws that save people. It's mercy." He glanced at Ethan. "You did good, son." The words caught Ethan off guard. Praise wasn't something he was used to. He looked away, pretending to study the horizon. We all did. The sheriff gave a small nod, then turned back toward his truck. "I'll send a few volunteers up from town. Folks are already talking about what you're doing here." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Good things, I hope." Grady grinned. "For once, yeah." Then he climbed into his truck, tipped his hat, and drove off, the sound fading into the distance like a memory at peace. Evening settled softly over whispering pines. The sky blushed pink and orange as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Clara brewed coffee in the small kitchen, its scent mingling with pine and smoke. Ethan sat outside with his arm in a sling, staring out across the meadow. The grass swayed gently, glowing gold in the fading light. Maggie appeared beside him, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "It's pretty here," she said quietly. "It's peaceful," Ethan replied. "That's rarer than people think." Shadow padded over, curling up between them with a soft sigh. Maggie leaned her head against Ethan's arm, and for a long time they sat without speaking, the wind whispering through the trees. Clara joined them with 3 mugs of coffee. One for Ethan, one with extra sugar for Maggie, and a third she kept for herself. She sat on the porch step, watching the light shift through the forest. "You know," she said softly, "the night of the storm, I thought none of us would make it out alive. I prayed harder than I ever have before." Ethan looked at her, the lines around his eyes deepening. "And now?" She smiled faintly. "Now, I think that prayer was answered. Just not in the way I, expected." The wind carried her words away like a hymn. Somewhere in the trees, a bird sang its final song of the day. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded paper. It was the adoption form for Whispering Pines Rescue Center, the legal proof that it was now theirs. He handed it to Maggie. "This place belongs to all of us," he said. "You, me, and this stubborn dog." Maggie smiled through the mist of tears. "Then we'll take care of it. All of it." Shadow barked once, tail thumping against the wooden porch. Ethan chuckled, ruffling the dog's ears. "Guess that's a yes." They watched as the first stars appeared above the darkening forest, scattered like promises across the sky. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt the kind of stillness that wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, of forgiveness, of something he hadn't believed in for years. Grace. The morning that followed came slow and golden. Mist rose from the valley and sunlight spilled over the treetops, touching every scar, every shadow, every new beginning. Whispering Pines stood quiet and strong, a sanctuary not just for the lost, but for those who had found their way back to faith, in the world, in each other, in the unseen mercy that had guided them home. Sometimes God doesn't answer our prayers by changing the storm. He calms our hearts within it. Ethan found peace not by escaping his past, but by opening his door to others who were lost. Maggie found family not by birth, but by faith. And through it all, love, the kind that asks for nothing, built a home stronger than any wall. If you believe in second chances, in the small miracles that happen when people choose compassion over fear, then it is your reminder. Faith still lives here. Share this story if it touched your heart. May the Lord bless you, your family, and every soul searching for home.